Jocalyn Clark, it's great to see you. Welcome to Global Health Insights. You are the international editor of the BMJ, and you published a very interesting article on the day this podcast is being released. And just give us the title of that article, and that'll give us the theme for this discussion.
Thanks, Peter. Really great to see you. The article's called "Who Will Be the Next Leader of the Beleaguered WHO?"
Who will be the next leader of the beleaguered WHO? So that's going to be the topic of our discussion today. And you're actually in Geneva now. We're talking a couple of days before a few days before the podcast is released. What's the attitude and the mood there like? I know it's early, but what do people feel like?
I think the mood is pretty poorly, actually. I think a lot of people are very concerned about the financial crisis befalling WHO. They're certainly worried about the geopolitical context in which we're living. And, the race for the Director General of WHO has started now. So lots of people chattering about it, but the mood is not great, not for the remaining year of our current Director General and not for what this leadership campaign is going to produce in terms of the perfect candidate.
And when you say started now, you mean both formally and informally, because there's a lot of people probably who haven't declared, but WHO itself, through the Director General, has written to member states outlining what the formal process is with country-led nominations that have to be provided to WHO, I think, by September of 2026, if I got that right. Anything you want to add about that process, or that's pretty well it?
Yeah, well, that's pretty well it. I mean, of course, the sort of chatter and the jockeying for who might be the next Director General started a few months ago. You would hear gossip and kind of information being traded among folks, and then rumors about who might be some of the candidates, and that's been reported by other outlets. But Dr. Tedros issued those emails to member states just on April 24th, so that's just a couple of weeks ago, setting the deadline of September 24th and inviting nominations. As far as I know, nobody has publicly declared their candidacy or their interest, but there will be lots of discussion over the next few days here in Geneva at the World Health Assembly. Not in the official events, of course, it's not on the official program, but in the cocktail bars and in the hallways, Peter, as you know, there'll be lots of discussion about not only who might be exploring candidacy, because the lobbying is going to start for sure now, but also what the perfect candidate should look like, what our next leader should look like. And that's what my article covers.
Right. So let's talk about your article. First, I just want to, this is kind of a disclose. It's kind of a proud moment. You and I have been friends for a long time, and it's terrific to see all the things you've done in science, technology, and medicine journalism. And congratulations on all your success.
Thank you, Peter. I mean, you're one of my oldest and dearest friends, and you're right. We've done some great work together with all sorts of colleagues that we value from all over the world. So thanks.
Great. So let's try to do some more today. In terms of your article, there's actually quite a bit of research that you did behind it. Tell us, Jocalyn, what did you do to get to the analysis that you reached and that you'll tell us about in a second? But first, tell us about your methods and some of the things you tackled there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. So it is a piece of journalism. My day job, of course, is as the international editor of the BMJ, and I spend most of my life editing and publishing content. But I do some reporting as a journalist, and that's what this is. It's a feature article in the BMJ, and it involved hitting the ground and the Zoom calls and talking to experts with deep experience of WHO. I got access to folks that I don't believe anyone else has got access to. And most of my sources and the reporting I did for the piece was on the record. But of course, I talked to lots of folks on background. Those are friends, colleagues within and outside WHO, some of whom didn't want to talk on the record. That's fine. But the people I do quote are experts from around the world, from different sectors, and they had strong views and divided opinion on both what the next leader should look like, let's say, in terms of a profile, but also how that's it's all mixed into all this expectation and demand for reform of WHO. And of course, you were one of my experts that I spoke to for the article. I really appreciate your perspective because you were special advisor to Tedros, and you've also been very much outside the organization in both research, clinical, and science. So I had a rich array of perspectives on the reporting.
Great. Yeah, that's terrific. And I was very happy to chat and share my views. And I always do that on the record. But there is a reason for anonymity. And did you want to just can you say how many people you interviewed and if there's anything you want to say about the journalistic rationale for anonymity and how you actually deal with that as a journalist? I think people would be interested in that in a few sentences.
I actually didn't quote anyone anonymously, that it's unnecessary, and that wasn't really what I was going for here. I probably talked to 10 experts from around the world, and we can talk in a minute about what they told me. But chatting with people on background is really important as a journalist, just to kind of get to understand the context, get to understand the feeling in the building and outside. And just to kind of understand, even talked a couple minutes ago about the process of the election. Yes, it sits on the WHO website, somewhere if you go digging around for it. But to be honest, it's kind of laid out in quite opaque terms. Like it's this like very formal kind of language. And so just tapping into people who have experience, let's say, of previous election cycles, of, what the mood is inside the building. WHO is, probably in its 78-year history, has not been in as deep a crisis as it is now. Much of it fueled by the financing crisis, that is, with the withdrawal of the US, but lots of other member states not increasing their contributions to WHO, but wanting more from it. Let's be fair, they're giving less, but wanting more. And what we know to be a steep cut in their workforce. They are cutting 25% of their workforce by this month. And what I'm hearing is actually that financial or budgetary crisis is deeper than it's been reported, and it's going to get worse. Things are looking worse this week than they were even a month ago.
Wow. And of course, none of us are happy to hear that, but it is what it is. And as you say, it does affect the election. And the people should just know that it's a one country, one vote secret ballot election, which really does change the dynamics. You said that I was involved in the election 9 years ago, and I was, and that was the first time it was that way. And that does change the dynamics. So you told us what you did, and it sounds pretty unique. Is there any element of uniqueness you want to highlight? You started to get into the findings already, and we're all eager to hear those. But anything you want to highlight just in terms of the approach that you took? The reporting, I think, is
Yeah,
interesting at this
yeah,
stage.
the reporting is pretty standard, but I'm really pleased with the kind of access I got. So, in
Mhm.
addition to yourself, I spoke to Larry Gostin, who you will know, distinguished professor at Georgetown in the US, but more importantly, self-described, longest and closest friend of WHO and Tedros. I mean, he's been through decades of change at WHO. He's been close to many director generals. He's observed the election cycles over the years. And then he's also, of course, close to past US administrations. So he was able to shed some light on, this question of what this next director general, and to be fair, what the candidates are going to do when asked about dealing with the US. I also got access and had a fantastic conversation with John Nkengasong, who's the founding director of Africa CDC, the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, who was also a diplomat for the US and oversaw PEPFAR, worked, I think, under the Biden administration as a diplomat. So having that kind of perspective was amazing. I spoke to Flavia Bustero, former WHO Assistant Director General, who, of course, you may know, and who stood as a candidate in the last cycle 10 years ago. And I spoke to a really fascinating conversation or interaction, I should say, with Priti Patnaik, who's the founder and publisher of Geneva Health Files. She's a fellow journalist, but she's somebody who her entire professional role is to cover WHO negotiations. So she really has that, like, it's just a very unique insight to always be in the building, always, kind of understand those things I was saying earlier that can be quite opaque to people like me and others who are outside of this international organization and are trying to figure out, how they work, what they do. And then I talked to some other scholars. I think what's unique is that I talked to scholars who aren't just health folks like us, global health people like us, but are more sort of from political science and international relations. And they really brought a lot more meaning to why this role is so important and why the crisis of the organization is not in its technical strength. It's in the politics.
Great. So let's get into it. You've already started to give us some hints about what you found. What did you find?
Well, I mean, a diversity of opinion for sure, and I had wide-ranging conversations. But the two main things that I report that I think will be really interesting to readers is first, sharply divided opinion on how the next DG should handle the US withdrawal from WHO, and in particular, how much time that DG should spend trying to court, you know, this world superpower and WHO largest donor until now, how much time they should spend on courting them back and what that might look like. And to be honest, I was surprised at some of the things I heard. Peter, this will interest you very much. Really strongly divided opinion on how political the organ should be going forward in its next era, and therefore, how political the next DG should be. And I know, I hope we talk about it. I know that you have, strong views on that.
Great. And you also said that they described the crisis itself.
Yes. I mean, 100% this race, and, it is a horse race. This is not, with respect to what you've described as this sort of more transparent and democratic part of the process, which is that at next year's World Health Assembly, a member state, so I think there's 190 of them now, will each cast a vote. It'll be secret, but everyone's got a vote, which is really interesting because that sort of like that redistributes power in a much more, I guess you could call it, egalitarian or equalized way. But prior to that, the executive board of the WHO will secretly, I think there's 34 of them, and people can, it's who those member states are, but 34 of them, they will vote in a secret ballot to shorten whomever throws their hat in the ring with the support of a member state. They will shorten the short list to a maximum of 3 people. So then, fast forward to May 2027, as you were saying, all member states will have, a way to, cast their vote. But my point is, it is still a bit of a horse race. There is lobbying, there is jockeying, there's presumably, because this is how it's always been in the past, there's going to be like trading of votes, and regional blocks are going to be really significant here, just as they were with the election of Dr. Tedros 9 years ago. But that race, this leadership campaign, and everything that's going to happen between now and then, which is like a lot of campaigning, some public forums, interviews, etc. All of that is happening, like you said, in the context of this demand for reform. So everyone I talked to confirmed these things are not separate. The organization is in a serious crisis financially, but also in terms of its sadly, in terms of its credibility and legitimacy.
Yeah. And I think in the article you described that as an existential crisis. And a little earlier you said that it was the worst crisis in WHO's history. So that's an important finding, that people think that that's the context. And I'll come back to that in a second. I want to mostly hear about your article, and then I'll share some thoughts, and we'll go a little beyond it in a second. People feel that WHO is in an existential crisis. And how did you describe in your article the kind of portfolio or the profile of the prospective future director general?
Well, on the basis of what I heard from a lot of people and what I hear from talking with folks is that it's like, in my mind, it just seems like the most incredibly impossible job. Highly complex, requires a polymath, or as others have described, a unicorn. But, kind of all that joking aside, I mean, this is a very complicated, complex job that I asked most of the people I spoke to, like, why would anyone want this job? This sounds really, really difficult and exceptionally stressful. I mean, Peter, you've worked closely with Dr. Tedros. I mean, you would know this firsthand how difficult this job is, and it's a 24/7 job. But at this moment in time, with WHO and the multilateral system writ large under attack, this person is going to hit the ground running a year or so from now with, very, very little room to breathe. So they've got to have the technical skill and expertise to bring that credibility and to speak with authority on health, counter rising attacks on science and misinformation. They've got to be a fundraiser. We've already covered the massive financial crisis, which is unprecedented, probably the depth of it. They've got to be a diplomat because they've got to be able to very carefully negotiate, not just in terms of mobilizing support and plugging all those holes. They've got to deal with these difficult decisions that they've made with their staff in WHO. You and I both know that place is full of talented, committed people. It is, on the other hand, massive now, and it's very bureaucratic. I mean, obviously, some very difficult decisions are going to have to be made there. So those diplomatic skill, I was told, is going to be both important for those organizational politics, let's call them, or challenges, but then also the external politics. I mean, how you manage 190 member states and I suppose to a certain degree try to keep people or states happy across such different political, geographic, cultural, linguistic, etc., like all those dimensions of difference that you would have in any kind of multilateral organization. And then, you've also, in a leader, I was told, and certainly I agree, you've got to be an exceptional communicator. You're not sitting in an office anymore. You've got social media, the traditional media asking you questions. I think, Peter, you were one of the people during my reporting who really emphasized, like 10 years ago, the DG was mostly talking to ministers of health. Now, the DG he or she is talking with heads of state. He or she is going to have a seat at the G20. Like, this is no longer small time kind of politics. This is very high level politics, and that takes exceptional communication skills. So to answer your question, I mean, what would you call that person? To me, it's an incredibly challenging portfolio, and it's going to take a very unusual and special person.
It is a somewhere between extremely tough and impossible job. You're right about that. And because of so many demands, and that's for anybody. And yeah, so polymath, I think, is a good way to put it. And you've got kind of technological expertise, you've got diplomacy, you've got fundraising, and in the elements that you raised, and communication. So that's terrific. And then maybe just to round out your findings, and then I'd like to get into them a little bit more, share some thoughts and maybe have some back and forth on them. But first, I just want to hear what you found and what you reported in your article that I think everyone should read, and we'll all look forward to reading it. You mentioned the U.S. and the kind of the split in view on the U.S. Some people thought that it was important to, well, let me put it in your own words. Take us a little bit deeper on what people were saying about the role of the U.S. And by the way, you mentioned 190-something member states. It's interesting that it's not even totally clear how many member states.
Yeah.
There were always 109, and then the U.S. left, and then Argentina left. But in the World Health Assembly that you're about to go to, they're debating whether Argentina really did leave because there was no exit clause in the Constitution. So it's probably 193, maybe 192. Who
Yeah.
knows? It's like Hotel California. Can you check out anytime but never leave? Anyway, so tell us about how people that split on the U.S. That's quite interesting, Jocalyn.
Yeah, it is. It was really, really interesting when Donald Trump, in his first week in office in his second term, which was January 2025. In fact, I think it was one of his first priorities was to withdraw the U.S., sadly, from WHO. I mean, I think there was probably, for the subsequent year, still some hope among U.S. scientists and global health leaders and the rest of us in the world that there might be a way to sort of tamper things down and maybe try to negotiate a kind of reconciliation. And our colleague Larry Gostin, who I spoke to for this article, was in fact heavily involved in attempts to reconcile an agreement between WHO senior leadership and the US administration, and also senior Democrat leaders. The Democratic Party leaders in the US were also involved. But that didn't, I mean, that unfortunately, I kind of got the impression that didn't even come close. I mean, they're just so on different pages. And I think on the basis of that, Larry in particular feels like that a return is not going to happen anytime soon. And therefore, his advice would be to the next director general, don't waste your time on immediately trying to court the US back, but instead on these reforms that we've been acknowledging, really hitting the ground running, get WHO back on track, take some tough decisions, make the organization more effective, more cost effective. And by doing so, then kind of lay the groundwork to enable a kind of period of trust building that might then hasten a future US return, possibly in exchange for certain reforms. But interestingly enough, in speaking with others, including my colleague Priti Patnaik, the journalist who covers WHO, I mean, she said something very interesting to me, which was, the next GG is also going to really need to be guided by what member states want. And there's lots of member states, never mind WHO officials, who don't necessarily want the US back. The US, I'm told, is often very heavy-handed in how they deal with WHO, even under Democratic administrations. And, we need to name the real challenge, or not the real challenge, another real challenge with the US, which is with them going so far right to what some have described as an authoritarian regime, their views, or at least the administration's views, on women's rights, sexual and reproductive health, immunization, these are at odds with not only WHO policy, but with global health needs. So then the question becomes very viable. Maybe we don't need them back, or maybe we don't want them back.
Okay, so that's the split you found in your reporting. Let me now go a bit beyond what you found to explore, or maybe what you explore a little bit. And you probably heard stuff like that. So my mantra on the election myself is more results, less politics. And let me take that one. Let me take those elements one by one. On the more results side, you have this crowd that keeps talking about norms and standards, keeps talking about technical expertise. Sure, yeah, but it's all process. Like at the end of the day, if you don't have results of improving people's lives in countries, you got nothing. And so there's a chain, a causal chain for sure, because it's countries that are responsible for the health of their citizens. WHO helps them. But there has to be some focus on that end goal of results. And I've always thought, and this is a little bit what happened at the beginning of Tedros' thing as well with the triple billion targets and delivery for impact stuff, which is, I have to say, not been as emphasized lately, if I was going to be mild about that in this conversation. But in any event, I've always thought that someone who was just relentlessly focused on results, maybe even in an entrepreneurial way, social entrepreneurial, whatever kind of entrepreneurial you want, but really just relentlessly focused on saving and improving lives in countries and working backwards to WHO's processes in terms of how to do that. That was where the focus really should be for a truly outstanding future director general. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that, kind of the gap between the norms and standards, technical expertise, blah, blah, blah crowd, and the and what you would see in someone who is just relentlessly focused on results, carefully tracking things and making sure they improved. Like, take one concrete example: universal health coverage has kind of improved a little bit by like 600 million people or something over the of the last 8 or 9 years, but that's basically keeping up with population growth. So in a sense, there's been no improvement in universal health coverage. And, think about the measurement of emergency preparedness and things like that. Anyway, for this purpose, what I wanted to just ask you about is whether you got into that at all, or whether you heard that at all, the gap between the norms and standards, blah, 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 technical expertise crowd, which to me is pretty vanilla, and backward looking, and kind of relentless focus on results. And we're really going to get results. And if we don't, I'm going to be held accountable for them. That kind of mentality of an entrepreneur, an entrepreneurial director general. Did you hear anything about that? Or do you have any thoughts
Yeah.
yourself about that chasm?
Yeah, I did, and I'm gonna come back to the norms and standards, blah, 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 in a second. But on your mantra, "More results, less politics," I definitely heard that from other people, and one person I spoke to whose views I really appreciated was Scott Greer, who's a political scientist and a professor of institutional management at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and he said something very similar around results because he believes that WHO is spread too thin, has too few resources, and isn't being listened to. So he feels that focusing on results can get the organization into, I think, what he described as a sort of virtuous cycle of reform so that they are holding themselves accountable to member states, but then driving accountability among member states that will allow WHO to get out of, as he described it, a kind of relationship where the organization is pandering to member states instead of having kind of independent authority and credibility with them. And demonstrating results, of course, is how you prove your accountability. And then it's almost like you're building trust whilst you're building credibility with member states who are your main champions and donors. And he felt that that was the only way to then land on this other goal and hope that people have for WHO, which is that it has a more enhanced credibility. To the norms and standards crowd, I mean, this makes me laugh that you call it kind of vanilla and blah, 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 because calling WHO a normative organization, saying that WHO needs to get back to its core scientific and public health mandate, or let's say its core mandate, is something that I heard over and over again. And I wanted to report it in my article. Of course, it's important. But at the same time, it didn't even get past the BMJ style guide to just describe norms and standards because they literally have no meaning for people. And I find like this is something that kind of compromises WHO, that people don't really understand either what it means to be a normative agency or what the value is in being an organization that does set standards. And so I think, I mean, if I was advising any of the candidates as they're preparing their teams and their messaging and their manifestos, etc., I would not go there. I would not go and lean on those old traditional kind of values and functions that we've often heard of in the past and try to find a different, more contemporary way of describing what credibility might look like, what a role and responsibility in this new world order would look like. And it seems to me, focusing on results and accountability is, certainly if I was a member state voter, that's what I'd want to hear.
Yeah, amen. And there's a lot more that we could talk about that. And I think we should at some point talk again as this race unfolds and talk about this more. But I wanted to go to the less politics side of the equation. Let's drill into that. So there is some politics you need. It's probably a good thing that the director general relationship has been elevated from health ministers to include health ministers, but now also includes foreign ministers and finance ministers and especially heads of state. That's probably a good thing. And you see it operative in international issues like the hantavirus thing, that kind of humanitarian coordination or coordination in outbreaks and emergencies does require high-level decision-making on the part of government. So it's good that the Director General does that. So that's not what we mean by less politics. I'm just trying to pin it down. Well, let me ask you, when people talked about overly politicized WHO, but you still wanted diplomacy, I just want to tease this out a bit, just a bit like we did on the results side. What do people actually mean by less politics, and what do they mean by politics, and what are the politics that they want to preserve? I'd want to preserve that high level diplomacy. I'd want to let me just ask that as a question. There's something I'd want to preserve. There's some things I'd want to lose. What did you hear a lot of that? What people mean by Diplomacy, politics, depoliticization. What exactly are they talking about? What do they want to keep and what do they want to get rid of?
Well, I mean, you're right. It is a bit tricky. Sometimes when we are talking about, you know, when is being political too political, we're sometimes mixing capital P politics with small p politics. And that's, part of the issue. But at the same time, there was really divided opinion. So some people, including yourself, have felt that, particularly, like, let's just use the example of conflict or war, that WHO would be better in not taking political stands, let's call it, on, or taking a side, if you will, on a political context, and instead just focus on the health and humanitarian consequences of conflict. I mean, on some level, that's understandable, but others raise concern with the fact that that's very, very difficult to do. So these who are going to come into this director general race, that's a fine line. That's a balance between being overtly political or taking a stand politically that might, not garner them any real benefit, either politically or on the ground, to appear to be taking a side on a conflict. But then on the other hand, given the health catastrophe and suffering, let's say in or Gaza are the two examples that are very top of mind for many people right now. How can the WHO leader not have comment, not, to a very large degree, have something to say that might appear political, but is about protecting the health, the rights of women, girls, health facilities, and in fact may believe that they have to stand up for people who are voiceless. So it was a very, very difficult but very nuanced and really enriching set of conversations I had around this question, which I hope I've done justice to in my article, because it's very clear that there is a fine line, that it is difficult to stay neutral when it comes to these issues because they do involve people's health and rights to such a degree that there is no other health agency in the world that stands up for people's health around the world. So you can understand, I think, why people feel strongly on both sides, but it is very much a fine line. Somebody I quoted, and I can't remember who it was, but it's in my article, I think said something quite kind of captured, I think, how you're feeling about it, which is our next DG needs to be politically sophisticated, but not political.
Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right to emphasize the idea of neutrality and impartiality, because that's a core value of UN organizations. The real question is whether a particular agency actually is neutral and impartial. And I think that is a question that future candidates should be pressed on, and in particular situations and contexts that are relevant to the mandate of the agency. So let me be concrete about what I mean. You mentioned conflicts, and their WHO has a mandate for attacks against health facilities. I mean, just to put it in a nutshell, I've written that if you only talk about attacks against health facilities and you don't talk about the militarization of those facilities, you're telling half the story and you're skewing the story. But there was a much more sophisticated report, Jocalyn, you may not have seen it. It just came out yesterday, and I'll put it in the show notes. It's from the Center for Medical Integrity. It was a detailed 60 or 70-page analysis of the SSA, which is the mechanism that WHO has for reporting attacks against health facilities. I thought it was analytically brilliant. It argued point by point, really sticking to here's the SSA, here's what it does, here's the critique of what it does, here's a recommendation on how to fix it. I think those kind of analyses, and people don't often go down to that level of granular detail. They certainly don't on the norms and standards, blah, blah, blah. As you pointed out, even in the style guide, people sometimes don't even know what they mean by norms and standards. I think it's the same thing here. I think if we had an intellectually honest conversation about something like a tax on health facilities, took a careful look at the SSA, which this report, which I'd encourage everyone to read, I think convincingly demonstrates is flawed and needs to be improved. And it gives specific recommendations for how. I think, putting a report like that in front of candidates and asking them for their reaction and whether they would follow any of the recommendations or not is really a way to get into the level of granular detail that we need. And so yeah, so that's a little bit what I mean by less politics, is taking a careful look at how some of these technical things and how the communications intersect. And really, the goal here is not favoring one side or another. The goal here is a neutrality and impartiality, which is a fundamental value of humanitarian organizations in the first place. So that's just some of my thoughts. I don't know if you wanted to react against them, and it will be great to see as this unfolds whether candidates actually look at that report or reports like that on politically contentious issues, and say where they stand on them.
Yeah, as I said, there's definitely a diversity of opinion, and I, welcome people looking at my article and reacting because it would be interesting to hear how others feel about it.
Yeah, terrific. Good. So let's leave that one there, like we left the results one there for now. On the U.S., I think I'm actually with Larry on that. I don't think anyone will actually be able to bring the U.S. back. I think it would be good if the U.S. came back for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is that WHO is a universal organization. And, if you have a big blind spot, that's not great for epidemic preparedness. It's not great for technical expertise. And, given the importance of the US in the world, it's a pretty big gaping chasm. So I think it would be a good thing if the US came back. I would predict, as Larry does, that it's not going to be feasible to bring the US back between now and next May. But I think it is feasible to create the enabling conditions for the U.S. to come back in the future, and that's what I think I'd be looking for anyway in a candidate. I don't know if people talked about the historical analogy of the Soviet Union and its client states leaving WHO in 1949 and coming back in, I think, 1954, 1955. Took 5 or 6 years. It's kind of there is a historical analogy there, and WHO did reform, including on issues of political accountability. I think that's when the regionalization actually started, so the accountability could be closer to the member states. There could be similar issues now, and you talked about linking reform to return. And yeah, so I think I agree with Larry on that one.
Yeah, yeah, and I think we're probably looking at if what I've been told is accurate, I think we're probably looking at about the same time horizon as what occurred previously when the Soviet Union suspended its membership. The other reflection I want to make, though, on the U.S. withdrawal, which I think listeners and my readers may not fully appreciate, is not just this massive hit to the budget because the US would have pulled, I think it's between 20 and 25% of WHO's operating budget. But it's the withdrawal seismic of scientific expertise, and it's the withdrawal of cooperation. We don't have time to talk about other US institutions like CDC and NIH, but there is a long, long, rich history of US scientific cooperation and collaboration around the world that is also being deeply, deeply compromised, if not completely decimated. And that's very, very bad for WHO's work around the world, bad for global health and science in a much larger context. But the reflection that I have is that that's also something that's going to be very, very difficult to recover. I mean, any expectation that people have that in, I guess, November 2028 or January 2029, I think that's when the next president will come, whether they're a Republican or a Democrat. If people have this expectation that, when it comes to health in an international context, things are just going to revert back to how they were before Donald Trump was inaugurated, I think they're, obviously very, very wrong, because it's very hard to roll back when you make these kinds of, era-defining decisions that have decimated everything you and I, Peter, knew about global health before has been almost entirely dismantled.
Yeah, and I think you're getting very close to what the fundamental problem is, and it actually folds into our discussion of politicization. My analysis of the issue with respect to the US is that unfortunately, WHO has I don't know what the best way to put this is, found itself managed to end up maneuvered into unintentionally US wedge politics. I think it's significant that on the first day now of the last couple of new administrations, it's like we're leaving WHO, we're rejoining WHO, we're leaving WHO. It's exactly the wrong place for an organization like WHO to be. And so one way to think about it is how do you get out of wedge politics in the US or anywhere else? And I do think that, the silver lining here if there is one. And by the way, I completely agree with your analysis. Is fundamentally the biggest problem is not about the money. The biggest problem is about the technical, the political, the other things that you mentioned, or diplomacy, given our earlier conversation. I think on the U.S. it's a matter of creating the enabling conditions. And I was going to say the silver lining is some, maybe not all, but some of the things that the U.S. is actually asking for, greater accountability for results, for example, are legitimate. And I hope that either with or without that U.S. pressure, and as we discussed earlier, WHO will move in that direction. Anyway, in the last few minutes, Jocalyn, let's turn to what's next. One thing we haven't talked about yet, and everyone's wondering yet, is the scuttlebutt and the gossip about specific names. We may want to just say, okay, we'll do that in a future episode when people actually declare. But I did want to give you the opportunity, if there's any specific names you've heard that you want to talk about, to say them, but also the opportunity to say, no, let's talk about that next time.
Yeah, no, I definitely think we should talk about that next time. Of course, I've heard many names bantered around as you have. Some have been reported by others. I actually list a number of individuals that I understand to be speculative or potential candidates, and I highlight those for BMJ readers because many of them are physicians or surgeons, and I think that's really interesting. I mean, I know, of course, it is the World Health Organization, but health as defined globally is much, much more than medicine. So I do have a list of folks. Without further comment in my article. But yeah, let's see what happens. I mean, for sure, I think some candidates that we think are going to throw their hat in the ring now, Peter, are probably likely to wait a little while and just read the tea leaves. So we've got the World Health Assembly, we've got G7 and G20 meetings over the next few months, or certainly before the EB meets. We've got a BRICS meeting. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity for lobbying and chatting among potential candidates and their teams with, the member states or folks who have decision-making power. And then I think closer to the autumn is when we'll see candidates. And I think it's really, really worth us in the global health community being engaged in this process because number one, there are opportunities for us and other parts of the civil society to get involved. We need to push for opportunities to put questions to the candidates. And then we should also be, all of us, and I hope the BMJ plays a part in this, scrutinizes the manifestos of those who are throwing their hat in the ring. We need to look at that from all the dimensions you and I have talked about over the last 45 minutes or so. And then, there'll be special interest groups really interested to learn about what these candidates have to say about, the financial crisis or the erosion of, women's rights and gender equality. I heard today, not 2 hours ago when I was on a call, someone saying, I need to find out if these candidates care enough about, antimicrobial resistance. So you imagine there's like a whole array of
I know.
top priorities. But I mean, that aside, I think you would agree that people in the global health community shouldn't feel isolated from this process, even if it feels a little bureaucratic and opaque. I mean, it's partly why I wanted to write this article and partly why I'm so grateful to you for inviting me on your podcast, because this matters to us. That individual is going to be coming into this role in a most auspicious time. This might actually be the most significant leadership contest in the history of WHO since 1948 or whenever it was established. So it does matter who this individual is. I mean, recognizing that it's not them alone, but we want someone who can bring together a really, really strong team and be able to navigate the stormy waters ahead. But then, secondly, as we talked about a little earlier, this person's going to be hitting the ground. They're going to have inherited a whole load of, stuff and a whole immediate set of challenges internally and externally. And I think by engaging with the process, we can be supportive observers, but participants in that process, because all of us, I think, we don't want to see the decline of this organization. I'll speak for myself. I don't want to see the decline of this organization. I want to see it be strengthened. I can't imagine a future without
Yeah, and my experience of the organization is that it's quite hierarchical culturally, which means that it's kind of like Margaret Mead in Samoa. You know, the leaders of the tribe really make a big difference on setting the culture. So,
yeah,
100% agree with you. And maybe one last thing um, is the insider outsider thing.
yeah.
Normally, if you think that an organization is in a crisis, you would want an outsider to come and deal with that crisis rather than someone who's been involved um, in developing that crisis. So I think you're finding that people see it as being in an existential crisis puts down an important marker on that. At the same time, there's no such thing as an outside white knight, or I don't know what the gender equivalent for, there wasn't too much gender equality in the Middle Ages, but a white dame or whatever you would call it. There's no rescue fantasy here that's going to work either, as I think somebody was writing about just today. I think maybe Pretty was writing that. And so it's also reasonable to think about an insider who actually has an honest critique of where they think WHO, how they think WHO got into the current existential crisis that your correspondents, your interviewees have identified, and has actually a good and honest analysis for how to fix it. So that finding of existential crisis does put down a marker that should tilt towards an outsider or an insider who is willing to say, maybe here's where we've gone wrong and here's how I would fix it. Did that come up or anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, it totally came up. I don't want to give away too many bits, and especially not the juicy bits of my article, because I want people to go read it. But what I will say is, I mean, you've kind of nailed it, that's the calculus, if you will. But I think on balance, even for people that were unwilling to say, I absolutely got the impression across the board that everyone thinks it's gonna be an outsider, and I'm sorry for those. There's gonna be some exceptional candidates who have insider credentials, but I think for the degree of change demanded and or needed, I think this is probably gonna tilt toward an outsider. That's where my money would be, and that's, I think, largely the vibe that I got from the people I spoke to.
Yeah. And for me, I've still got an open mind on that issue in terms of because I don't believe there's such thing as a white knight.
Yeah.
I don't believe in kind of the great man or woman theory of WHO director generals, the savior theory. And there's some people with a lot of integrity and a lot of thoughtfulness and a lot of caring on the inside, but they haven't yet differentiated themselves from the current course. And I think that's a very important piece of the puzzle and a good analysis. So anyway, I've got more of
Well,
an
yes,
open mind
that's
on
a
that.
very good point. So if folks considering candidacy, what they should take from my article is exactly that.
Yeah.
It's not so much that dichotomy, which is quite false between insider outsider, but one's got to, on the basis of the experts I spoke to and what I'm hearing around town, is to accentuate your external credentials and your experience externally that you can really bear. But, I mean, Peter, this is, it's not us voting. And it's none of those global health experts or commentators I spoke to and are being, quoted in other magazines as well. It's member states. And you and I both know that member states may vote very, very differently. And we may end up getting a candidate that, surprises us all.
We may. There are some, well, there's all kinds of issues there. But one of them that's directly relevant to this conversation we're just having is, there's a lot of personal relationships and familiarity and likability associated with these elections too. And that tilts towards insiders. And so, I think it'll be very interesting to see how that insider outsider thing unfolds. And we've maybe laid down some considerations for people and for candidates to think about. So, Jocelyn, I think it was wonderful to speak with you about this. Congratulations on your
Thank
article. I'll
you.
put the reference and the link in the show notes so people can find it. I'd encourage everybody to read it. I would just want to underscore what you were saying before, that this is something that anybody who cares about health anywhere in the world should get involved in, engaged in, because a director general really does set the tone. And so I just completely agree with you. I hope we can have this conversation again as we get specific names and do a little bit more analysis of what's going on in this election. Just before we wrap, I wanted to give you a chance to say anything else you might want to say that we haven't covered or that you'd like people to hear or know.
Just thank you so much for inviting me on your podcast, which I love, and I really enjoyed our conversation. And yeah, I look forward to many more over the next year as this campaign unfolds.
Same here, and have fun at the World Health Assembly. That's kind of a oxymoron. I don't know how you can actually have fun there, but good luck, and I
Thank
know
you.
you'll try. All right,
I will. I
terrific,
certainly will. Okay.
great.
All the best.
Thanks.